turn, yes, great, got it. Okay. So I live in Vermont in the United States. My father immigrated here from the UK during the war, and I've had great friends and some family there. So I've spent a lot of time there, and the last few years have been doing some things with Pasture for Life, and it's been really fun getting to know the program there and getting to know that area of the High Weald and meeting some of the farmers and walking the land. So I'm really pleased to be able to do this from a distance because couldn't quite make it work fast enough to get me over there, though. But I'm hoping that later in the year we will meet each other in person. And so today's topic is one that I have taught on a lot. There's a 5-week course that I've taught multiple times, usually 3 or 4 times a year for the last 5 or 6 years. So there are thousands of people who've had this course, but it's always, the topic is so key that it kind of almost can't be done enough, which is thinking about land as a whole living system, and how soil structure and function, or what I call the soil sponge, so structural and functional integrity of the soil, how that feeds into so many other issues that we're looking at, that we're living through, ways that one would never imagine. So everything from human health to flood resilience to fires to economics, etc. So let's put this slideshow up here. And okay, so, oh, is that showing as a slideshow?
You can see all your slides down the side, so
that's
it's not
funny. Okay, I'm asking it to do a slideshow. Let me just, sorry, there's always trouble whenever you share a screen, isn't there? Hang on. Let me turn off this slide. It's maybe because the slideshow is going in the background. Oh, come on. All right, well, let's try that one more time here. All right.
still showing on the left.
Yeah. There we go. Okay, that should have done it. Yes?
Yep, that's
okay, great. Okay. So my aim here is to grow this group's capability to see, or what I call image, which is different than imagining, the living systems at work, so whole systems, in a way that reveals the work of life that's often hidden from us, so that each of you can start to see opportunities to evolve the food and land systems around you in ways that benefit not just humans, but all of life. And this idea of imaging is a really key one, in terms of that it means bringing to mind, being able to see in one's mind's eye the processes of life, where you start to become familiar enough with them that when you look at a landscape, or when you're thinking about a place, or when you're thinking even about your own family, that you have a sense of how things are working in a systemic way. And when we can image things in that way, and have a realistic image, bring it to mind, we can start to see intervention points that we couldn't see before. Places where in this big complex system that all these things are going on, we can say right here, I think, is the next most important thing to work on. So if you would put in the chat a bit where you are now, what changes you're seeing either from land degradation or climate change, and other challenges that are going on, things that you're worried about. Just take a minute to put those in the chat, or you could unmute. We're a small enough group.
Yeah. I'll put
We've
on
got
mute.
a shy group here today.
Yeah, I'll start. I see. I'm seeing a real loss of insects. There's so few insects around, and the ones I see, I recognise. And it used to be that I regularly see insects that I didn't recognise as a child. It was, you know, a normal thing, and now it's a thrill to see one.
And yeah, biodiversity loss. Louise says changes in weather patterns. I'm curious actually to know what kinds of changes in particular people are seeing. Fidelity, yeah, just go ahead and unmute Fidelity. We're a very small group here today, so.
I
So
actually can't make the chat element work, but that
that's
might
interesting.
be my. Oh, there's a few have just come through. That might be my computer because I've been struggling with it this evening.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, go ahead and just we can just talk out loud. I prefer that anyway to get to know people.
So I suppose that I agree with Deborah about insects, but actually also long periods of fixed weather. So we seem to get long periods of rain and then very long periods of drought. So the weather is it feels to me like it gets stuck in in a pattern, and then it moves on to something else. Oh yeah, somebody's just put that on the chat now.
Yeah, and then also soil compaction from very wet winters, nutrient runoff into water courses. Yeah.
I wondered.
Are there any fires happening there? We're having them in odder and odder places here in North America.
They're definitely happening increasingly on the Ashdown Forest, where there wasn't so many fires.
So more flooding, more waterlogging, less biodiversity, baseline syndrome where people don't know what was there before. Yes, definitely that.
There are warnings at the moment for possible wildfires in Scotland, and
Really? Okay. Yeah.
which is unheard of at this time of year.
Exactly, right? Especially with water all around, right? It's very odd. Okay.
Dee Dee, I wondered whether it'd be useful if someone's a farmer if they say that they are, because I think one of the ideas is to get
Yes, to help know who's doing what, and we'll have a little more time for introductions later. But Martin, seeing less grass, longer summer conditions, reduced grazing capacity, less water, and the water temperature's higher. Interesting. Kim, more mental health issues as less people are in touch with nature. Yeah, really key. Great. Okay, well, feel free to keep putting things in. But what we're going to talk about today is how so many of these things are related to and can be addressed by this funny little clump that we see on the screen. This is what I call the soil sponge, or the structural and functional integrity of healthy soil. And what you are seeing here, and this is magnified, but not hugely magnified. These are little particles of sand, silt, and clay, or broken down rocks. You can see they're shiny, and the shininess is two things. Part of it is water films that are stuck to them, but part of it is also these biofilms, or the slimes and glues of life that are from all of the life that's in this soil that has moved through there and created a glue that holds the little particles together into what's called soil aggregates. And then there are these threads that tie the aggregates together, and these are fungal hyphae of mycorrhizal, primarily mycorrhizal fungi. And then you can see there are some roots also that are moving through there that also help to aggregate the soil. So the aggregates actually tend to form first along the roots, because that's where the soil life is attracted to the sugars that the roots exude out. They're called exudates. And so bacteria and other life will come to feed off of those sugars underground, just like people and animals feed off of the sugars that plants produce above ground in, leaves and berries and grains, etc. And so plants are feeding life above and below ground. And so the aggregates, these clumps, will tend to form along the roots first, but then as the roots shrivel up and go away, or maybe are eaten and nibbled on by someone underground, the aggregates start to form all over the place. So there are leftover aggregates everywhere. And really importantly, though, in this picture, the most important thing here is not any of the things that you see in it. It's this just simple space, these void spaces underground, which you could think of as like the cathedrals underground. It's where everything happens. And the void spaces are so important because what are the two most important things before food that any living thing needs? Is air and water. So having air and water underground as well as above ground is key to have a really, really thriving living system. And then the having a what's called a soil food web, or food web underground, just like above ground, is also how nutrients and to a certain extent water are passed along from one living entity to the next. So these fungal hyphae come down and actually can break down the little tiny bits of rocks, and the bacteria help with that and make nutrients available to the plants, because these hyphae connect back into the plant roots, and the plants can send out a signal and say, hey, I need a little bit of copper and I need a little bit of selenium. Can you go find me some? And the fungal hyphae will go searching all through here, and it makes it easier when there's space to find the right nutrients for the plant at the right time in the right amount. And we'll talk a lot more about that in the webinar that's about health. So air and water underground, correct conditions for life. It also is like a layer of insulation. So if you think about wool or a blanket or whatever you have in the walls of your house, it's a lot like this. There's structure to kind of hold it together, but there's also airspace. So this means that plant roots have a slower conversion, less likely to freeze, less likely to get too hot. So it's creating an insulating, climate controlled environment for the other life underground as well. The other thing that we're seeing here is structural integrity. So these slimes and glues of life, these biofilms, are like other slimes. If you think of egg white or mucus or things like that, right, that are also created by life. When they dry, if you don't wash your handkerchief or you leave your scrambled eggs bowl unwashed in the morning, by the time you come back in the afternoon, it's very hard to clean. So these slimes have a really interesting quality that they're slippery and movable at first, but once they're dry, they are they tend to hold their structural integrity. We have whole painting techniques going back thousands of years based on egg tempera, right, for that same reason. So this holds this structure really nicely, and they are not water soluble unless they're really soaked for a long time. So these aggregates can hang together even if the soil is flooded. And I like to talk about this as a soil sponge. And just like a kitchen sponge, the two things that make it useful is that it can soak up water. So you can see that there's space here for water to be held and for rain to soak in. But also that it doesn't fall apart when it's wet. So if every time you put your kitchen sponge in the dishpan, if it fell apart, it wouldn't be a sponge, right? Or if it had no holes to soak up water, it also wouldn't be a sponge. All right, so those are some of the qualities of this that make it such a magical thing. And I like to talk about this as the essential infrastructure that makes life on land possible, and life underground possible as well. So another metaphor that I use a lot is thinking about soil that doesn't have that structural and functional integrity is like flour. And if you think about any baking that you've done, you kind of know what happens, the qualities of flour. If we were to pick up this plate and put it out in a windstorm, and if this was soil, if this was unaggregated soil or soil that doesn't have structural and functional integrity, what would happen to those little soil particles? They would all be airborne. So, and airborne soils create a lot of problems. They create air quality issues. Here in the United States, it can get so bad that we have huge pileups of accidents on the highway from blowing soils. They can create a lot of health problems because the blowing soils often have bacteria in them that are not supposed to be inside our lungs. They can land on snowfields and glaciers and make them melt much more quickly, which is problematic for places where that depend on a slow melting tops of mountains, like in Switzerland, etc. They're slowly trickling down through the whole spring and summer. If it all melts at once because there's a lot of dark soils that's landed on it, that's a problem for water flow later in the season. And just before we go into the next piece of this, the way that soil becomes degraded like this is a few different things. It can become degraded because it doesn't have any plants feeding it. So we need those plant roots to feed the workforce that creates that sponge. It can become degraded and flower-like by having too much disturbance or tillage or too much plowing. It can become degraded by being left bare and exposed to the elements. It can become degraded by having too much of a monoculture because it's the diversity of plants that help to feed a diverse workforce underground and above ground. It can become degraded by using too many fertilizers, like nitrogen-based fertilizers, or by using too many biocides or pesticides that kill off the workforce. So many different reasons. Also compaction, though it's interesting if you have that spongy soil, it's more resilient to compaction because it's spongy, and you can feel that under your feet. But if you keep driving heavy machinery over it, or if you flipped over soils to create an apartment building or something and lost all of the sponge, it's maybe been shoved underground or mixed up with everything else, all of the subsoil, you can create compaction. Or grazing, certain times of year, there probably shouldn't be a lot of heavy animals on there. Or if the animals aren't moved frequently enough, we can also see a breakdown of that structural and functional integrity of the soil. So the other thing that I like to do here is to pretend that we're having a rainstorm on this landscape. So poke a few holes in a cup, get some water. This is fun to do at a dinner party. I've done it at the United Nations. I've done it in kindergarten classrooms, done it all over. Everybody gets this. And what happens when it rains on soils that don't have that structural and functional integrity? So we get runoff. We get flooding almost instantly from that runoff because nothing is soaking in. We get pollutants in soils and nutrients going into the streams and lakes and rivers, creating algae blooms and dead zones, etc. So we have flooding, but we also have a drought because as soon as this dries, there's nothing that's gone down there for the plant roots, right? If you ever bake a pie or make a cake, you know that if you lift up this little sticky film on the top, it's completely dry underneath. There's nothing down there for the plant roots. So flooding and drought are two sides of exactly the same issue, that the water's not soaking into the landscape. So it either runs off quickly, or it's it's out and it's gone. So there isn't water under there for the plant roots. There are we do also, this is also related to these weather systems that come and we have too much water for a certain amount of time and then not enough rain. And that we may or may not get into today, but we will before the end of this series, as how the soil sponge is foundational not just to climate resilience, but also to the whole way that climate works as a whole itself. So by having a soil sponge across more of a landscape, more of a continent, etc., we can help to even out that rain flow. So if you put this out in the hot sun, this is going to form a crust, and it's going to be even harder for the next rain to soak in. And if, if you're in Scotland right now, or somewhere that is maybe just had a fire or about to perhaps have a fire, the fuel that lands here, so dead wood, dead leaves, etc., this is a landscape that is not going to have enough moisture in it because the water is all running off. It's not going to have enough moisture to have a good population of saprophytic fungi, which are the ones that break down dead wood. It's not going to host the kind of chewers and shredders that can break down plant material. So you end up with a lot more standing fuel and a lot more dryness, and the water that does fall evaporates more quickly. And this also can form a lot more heat in the area. So there's lots here that we can't get to all of, but just say that if there's no water and no insulation space here in the ground, then the plants can't transpire and cool the air. The soil surface is not protected from heat, and so it's going to radiate back more heat, and again that's going to evaporate more water, and it becomes kind of a feedback loop. Okay, so that's what happens when we lose that structural integrity and functional integrity of the sponge. But we have something that we can do. So what's the difference between flour and bread? Is life, right? So bread has been in contact with yeasts, and it's not quite the same thing with soils, but basically life has taken something that looks like this and created a structure that has those pore spaces and that has that structural integrity that doesn't fall apart when it's wet. And this is actually very, very similar to the way the soil sponge works. So if we were to take this out on a windy day like the other plate and blow on it, it's not going to blow away, right? So the air quality is instantly going to be better. That influences public health, both for humans and all other life, anything else that has lungs. It's going to leave those snowfields and glaciers pristine white, which is more albedo, which is cooling for the climate, and also keeps that frozen water frozen longer and slower, so there's more of a trickle of water during the spring that helps to not have the flooding and have more of a consistent flow of water through the spring and summer. So that's if it's out in the wind, but it's also resistant to falling apart when water falls. And so let's just look at this. Anyone who's played with their food kind of knows this, but seeing them side by side is kind of extraordinary. So you can see that the rain is soaking in. Nothing's running off. We're not having that erosion or mudslides. And I can generally put 9 or 10 times as much water here before we even start to see the water. So it's all soaking in, going down there for the plant roots, for the other life underground, moving downwards. And of course, this so-called soil is only about a couple of inches high. So hopefully you wouldn't have a rock slab under there. But even if you did, by the time we start to see it again, it's now bubbling up in springs. Okay, it's not a flood. This is coming up from underground, coming up in springs, refilling wells, and it is clean and clear. So it's being cleaned by moving through this big carbon filter of all of the living life that's in there. And it's also being cleaned, not in this demonstration, but in an actual landscape. It's being cleaned by the life that is there. So if there are things in there that shouldn't be in there, like petrol or antifreeze or that kind of thing, the life underground, if it's a very living landscape, can take a lot of those long carbon chain chemicals and break them back down into their parts and put them back into use. So we see a lot of interesting things happening now with mushrooms being used to revitalize places where there have been waste spills and factory settings, etc. So huge difference here between this landscape and this one. And here you've got water protected from evaporation, held at the root zone. This, of course, in a real landscape, this could be, 3 feet, a meter deep, or more, before you get down to the subsoil. And by the time you get down to the subsoil, unless it's utter complete clay or rock, it's still going to be seeping in because there's plenty of time for that to seep in. Okay. This is another picture of the soil sponge where you can see more of those fungal hyphae holding it together. But let's look at 2 examples of what it looks like in real life, because we are not actually working with bread and flour, we're working with soils. So this is a photo from the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And you can do this at home with any kind of a jar and a little piece of screen, or I sometimes use an onion or potato bag and just secure it with a rubber band up at the top. And if you put a clump of healthy soil in the top and a clump of degraded soil over here, fill them up with water first and then lower it into the water. The healthy soil, because it has those slimes and glues that have dried, that are water resistant, even when it's sitting in water for 10, 12, 24 hours, that water is going to stay clean and clear. Even if it does eventually fall apart, the water is still going to stay clear, because every one of those little soil aggregates is coated with those biofilms that help to hold it together. Whereas this one, almost as soon as you put it in, the water turns brown and it all falls apart. So one way to know whether the fields are really have that nice, healthy soil sponge quality to them is to look at what the color is of the rivers and streams that are moving through those fields. Because if that water is sheeting off of the top and the soil doesn't have structure, after a big rain, it's going to look brown like this. Whereas if it's in a really healthy place and the water is seeping down and then coming out the sides into the river, coming up from underground into the river, sure, you'll have a little runoff here and there, but for the most part, it's going to stay clean and clear even if you've got more water moving through. Here is another example of this kind of an extraordinary one. This is called a rainfall simulator. And there's like a shower head that has put a few inches of rain on a few inches of soil here. Each of these is a bit like a big cookie cutter that has cut out an intact block of soil. So there's like a screen underneath here, and then a jar to capture it underneath, capture whatever water is moving through, and then a jar in front, because they're slanted a bit, to capture the runoff. So here you can see that none of the soil health principles are being used. So the soil is heavily tilled, it's a monoculture, it's been left bare, plenty of chemicals used in the farming system. And what's happening here is just like that flower, literally not a drop of water has gone through, even though it's not a very deep pan here. It has all run off, and like that last slide, it's taken a lot of soil with it, and the soil is falling apart. You can even see here how the soil looks sort of slimy on top, because those little small silt and clay particles have fallen apart, and now they're creating a slimy coating on top of this that, like I said, when it's out in the sun after that, it's going to dry and harden and seal the soil off and make it much harder for the next rain to soak in. So here we've got flooding, we've got terrible water quality, right? Bad for everything in the water because it's not just taking the soils, it's taking all those chemicals with it. And we've got dry wells and drought a few weeks later. We've got flood damage from that. That's not fun to be shoveling out of your basement or your shop if you've got muddy water coming in. And generally this is not good growing conditions. If you were to flip this pan over, I've seen this done with these rainfall simulators, a big cloud of dust would come up after you've put all that rain on there. And it's often called the oh shit moment because the people watching it have been told that what you need to do to get water to soak in is to heavily till the soil, right? Or to take the vegetation off. And that's exactly not correct. That we can see it from this. As we go over to the left, we've used more and more of the soil health principles. So here, maybe eliminating tillage and some of the chemicals, but still not leaving much plant mulch or living plants on the surface. Over here, now you can see they're starting to leave a lot of plant litter on the surface, but no living plants there. And as we go further over, though, we get more diversity and we get living plants there as much of the year as possible. And this system's probably got some grazing animals in it as well, or it might be a hay field. But look what's happening in the jars at the back. So here, this water is clean and clear. Like I would happily drink this water. It has all soaked in, nothing has run off. And I find it kind of interesting, the difference between this one and this one, because here you could say, well, even more water soaked in. But what's happening here is that the water's not being held in the soil either. It's kind of gone whoosh, straight through. Whereas this has a little bit less because it's, you know how when you water a potted plant in your house, and some of them after you water them and even if it's gone through, they're really heavy. And I'm not gonna have to water this for 2 more weeks. It's holding the water in there. So that's what's going on here. And other plants in your house, you water them, it all goes over the top and goes onto the rug and you're out there sponging it up. That's what this is like. It doesn't soak in at all. It's just going over the edges. And then we have everything in between. Now, what's really interesting is that if you study soils in school or, in a farming course, they'll tell you that the difference between soils that soak up water versus have it run off, or the rate of infiltration, is how much sand, silt, or clay is in the soil. So the size of the particles of the soil. And it is true that a very sandy soil will tend to have water go through very quickly. And a heavy clay soil, it's going to be harder for it to soak in. But what's interesting here is that these are all from the same farm, all the same soil type. So what this shows is that no matter what soil type you have, you can improve it by using the right soil health principles or farming practices. And in fact, sandy soil, very sandy soil, by using these soil health principles, will actually hold water a little bit longer. It won't soak through so quickly because you have more complexity and more space underground, not just the space between the sand particles, but little pockets where it can collect in organic matter for it to hold on to. Okay, so I've said some of this, but just we'll do a quick little list here of how does nature continually regenerate, which is to grow and repair and even evolve the soil sponge, and how can we participate? So if we look at a natural system that where things are kind of all humming, that is diverse, et cetera, and has diverse vegetation, you'll see that the soil sponge develops without us having to do anything. And what's happening there is that photosynthesis has been maximized. So plants grow at all different shapes and leaves and heights, and any little bit of sunlight is going to find an angle that it can work on the leaves so that there are always, always, always sugars being made that can go down and feed the underground workforce. And there's also always both living plants on the surface, but also dead plants. So something to protect the soil surface, both through both of those, and also food and moisture holding capacity and reducing evaporation by having the surface covered. So it's very rare to see truly bare soils out in nature, other than in little small places here and there. In nature, there are minimal physical, chemical, and biological stresses. So of course, it changes from time to time, but when we have a diverse landscape, those stresses may come and go, but they're not there all the time. So unless a rabbit comes along to dig a hole, generally the soil is undisturbed. There isn't a lot of tillage. Things eat each other, but there are no chemicals being used in nature that kills everything off, right? No big massive herbicides or insecticides. In a truly natural system, the herds of animals would tend to move through, whether it's birds or insects or elk or deer, etc. We don't have as many fences, we don't have very many roads, so things can move with the seasons, with the temperature, with the things greening up hills and down hills. And so everything gets a chance to rest, but everything also gets a chance to be grazed. And both are important in a system. There's plant diversity above ground, which increases the biological diversity as a whole above and below ground, because everything eats different food for different kinds of things, different habitat. So the more diversity there is in general of plants, you're going to see more diversity of birds and insects and mammals, etc. And then, and let's not forget reptiles. There's a diversity of animals that then do all these other jobs. So the animals help to move nutrients, for example, uphill against gravity. If you have a very hilly landscape, every time it rains, it's going to tend to wash nutrients down, including the nutrients that are in poop. But if you have grazing animals that move with the seasons, they're going to graze this lovely valley grass down here, and then they're going to move up with the seasons to cooler temperatures and bring those nutrients back up, bring seeds back up, bring microbes back up, so that it keeps going around and around. If you're lucky enough to have beaver and other things that like to make little dams, then you'll have animals that help to regulate water flows. Having animals of all different sizes that dig tiny tunnels like ants up to bigger tunnels means that if you haven't had rain for a long time and you get a big rain, it can start to flush down there and help to moisten the underground soil, which can help to pull more water in. Do you know how, back to the sponge metaphor, how if you leave a sponge and it's completely dry by the side of the sink, it does not mop up water very well. So having this ability to have that first flush of water move down through these holes of mice and voles and ants and other things, snakes, etc., can be very useful under those circumstances. And then let's not forget the pollination, which happens through a variety of ways, and also seeds sticking to different coats and blowing in the wind, etc. And then things work best when they're working within their local context. So the plants that have grown in an area for a long time learn survival strategies and have immune systems that are adapted to that place. And the same thing for animals, the same thing for people. So learning about what's not, there's a big push against invasives or so-called invasives. And I'm not really talking to that because that's actually a more complicated conversation than it's often made out to be, because there are plants that come in to do certain jobs when the land is degraded. We can talk more about that if you want, but it's more a matter of understanding, the slope of the land and what likes to be here, and notice what is growing and read the weeds to say, oh, look, if we've got lots of these thistles, there must be some compaction that they're trying to break up, and you know, what do people and animals that live there want to eat, and what is this place made for? So really understanding that. Okay, I think I might stop there. That's been a lot of talking and sharing, and see what people are thinking, if there are questions, clarifying things. I love to have this be more of a conversation rather than a lecture. This first one, there's quite a lot of information, but love to hear from all of you. And don't be shy. If you want, we can pause the recording, but I do love to capture the conversation if we can, just for our purposes.
Martin might want to unmute and expand, because he's talking about what he sees in the mountains in the Pyrenees.
Great, and yes, I'd love examples. You know, this I'm not the expert here. You are all the experts of your local place, so I can talk in generalities, but I would love to hear what this looks like where you are, and how you've seen this in action, and how you know whether the soil is spongy. Martin, would you like to tell us more about what you wrote there?
Aha. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Excellent. Okay, right. I'm in the French Pyrenees, which is quite near where you are. But one of the things we're looking at, you expect with climate change to see a northward expansion of species distribution, right? But in mountains or any hilly areas, you also see a vertical one.
Yes.
Okay, so plants start to migrate upwards if they can, and livestock and other herbivores help this a great deal, because they eat plants, including the seeds, and then they go for a walk for a while and maybe higher up, and then the seeds pop out neatly wrapped in a nutrient-rich coating.
Yes,
And
yes.
then the animals and their friends trample on them and sow them.
Yep.
All right.
Yes.
This
Isn't it brilliant? It's amazing.
It also happens for other herbivores. I mean, like we have some bears, which are a bit of a mixed blessing when we're talking with farmers, especially sheep farmers. But they are also herbivores, and they do the same thing. There's just not so many of them. Okay, so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a vertical migration of plants first, and then with the plants will follow the insects. Yeah.
Yes.
And then insect-eating birds, etc. But gradually we're seeing species moving upwards.
Yes, and one of the things I like to remind people of, which I had never thought about until someone else mentioned it, is that insects are grazing animals. So the herbivore insects. But there are, I think there are something like 1,700 carnivorous or omnivorous insects for every one that's a crop-eating insect. And if we spray insecticides, like at least in the US, people are very, very heavy with the insecticides, we're killing them all off. And then who has food first? The ones that like to eat the crops. So we see increasing numbers of so-called pests, the more insecticides that we use. But in a more natural landscape, there are having some insects up in the tree canopy that are munching on the leaves and sending those droppings down is a grazing system in and of itself, right? It's and perfectly healthy and fine to have some nibbling going on. So
you only have to watch bats and look at how high they're flying. Yeah. And you'll see them going across the top of the tree canopy.
Yeah.
So that tells you where their food is.
Right.
Right. And higher still sometimes, because there are small insects much higher up.
Yeah.
That's one thing. Domestically kept bees, here in France, we class those as livestock. Yeah. I mean, we have summer transu months when livestock is taken up the mountain, and that includes bees. Beekeepers take their hives up there,
Yeah.
right? So bees are livestock just like cattle are or sheep are.
Mm-hmm.
A quick word about transu months. Basically, summers are very hot in the valleys, and that means not much grass gets grown, and there's not much water, and there's a lot of insects. And what grass there is, you need to make hay for next winter. So during probably May, June to October, take livestock up the mountain where it's much cooler, there's more grass, there's more water, etc. Problem at the moment with climate change is that there's less grass than before. So they're coming down at the moment in October, maybe 2 weeks earlier than before. There's also less water. And we're also seeing the temperature of the water that exists is higher than before. So
Yeah.
if it's got higher temperature water, it's got a lower capacity to hold gases, such as CO2 and oxygen.
Yeah. And I'm assuming you're seeing reduced snowpack as well.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Which is a lot of that dryness and the lack of the grasses and the lack of the springs. Yeah.
All of that, and reduced
Yeah.
albedo, of course,
Yeah.
because of that also. Glaciers are melting.
Yeah. Thank you, Martin. Great
Pleasure.
case study. Others? Any other examples?
I farm in Cumbria, and we have rights to graze ruminants on common land. And on our common, we have had some FIPL funding to do some soil testing and baselining just to see what might be there. Well, I've been doing a soil course. I did your course as well, Dee Dee, last year. And so I've got a microscope, and as well as the conventional tests that the FIPL funding actually paid for with the University of Exeter, I got some little soil samples and was so excited about how much life is actually in these undisturbed areas
Yeah.
of the country
Yeah.
compared to our own land that we have our fields, and they're permanent pasture. We don't plough, but the amount of bacteria, fungi, nematodes, exciting things that are out there in the different kinds of soil, and trying to get my head around how those different kinds of soil make up the soil sponge. What's under the acid grassland? What's under the peatland? What's under the swampland and things? It's been really quite eye-opening trying to get this baseline of what's going on. So that's what I've been doing.
What are the tests that they're doing? You said that there's been funding for certain testing. What are they?
Well, they've
testing
done the conventional tests, the sort of tests that our government are suggesting we do, which are, they've done more, but the sort of tests that measure the NPK, the pH, we've done that.
Yep.
We've done oh dear, we take a block of land and they dry it out to see how much carbon is there. Yeah.
Okay, and bulk density, like
But they've done the bulk density.
Yeah, weight per volume. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
And did they do water? Did they do water infiltration testing?
They
or was
did
it all send
water
away?
infiltration as well. Yeah.
And what did you find from that? Because that's one of the most direct. That and the bulk density are two of the most direct measures of the soil sponge structure.
I probably shouldn't say it openly on a. We are having difficulty. We are having difficulty getting the reports back.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That's one thing. If you were dealing with the biology, you can't mess about, because if you're seeing what life's there, you have to get on with it. Whereas I presume the tests all went ahead, but the university has been so busy with all sorts of other things.
Yeah, no, that happens. But so I will, if we have time later, I will show you a sheet that tells all the different kinds of ways that you can tell whether your soil sponge is improving or degrading.
Brilliant.
And there are lots of measurements we can do, even as simple as just taking a jar of water and pouring it on the ground and watching it. Even if you don't have an infiltration ring, you can get something from that. And many people kind of feel with their feet, you can feel, are you clumping along and it's very hard, or does it give you a spring in your step? And then the other simple one is to simply take a spade or a shovel and dig out a bit and look at it and see how deep are the roots going. Do they go down just an inch and stop, or do they keep going? Is there a point at which there's a lot of compaction and they start growing sideways? And does the soil look like it has a lot of space in it and you can see those aggregates forming along the plant roots? Or is it just very like flour running out of your hand? That test where we were looking at the 2 jars, that's a very easy one to do and can give you a lot of information about whether your soil is forming those aggregates, whether it has those biological films in there that are coating the soil aggregates. So lots that you can test yourself without having to wait for anybody else.
Right.
And it's great to take snapshots and things like that, so that so you can notice, remember a year later what it looked like, how it performed, etc. So even if it's just in a notebook. Anyone else?
I've just got a very funny, well, I just saw this article on bats. It was what was said about bats in the insects, and that there's some libraries that are now keeping bats in their libraries to keep down the insect populations. That's a bit of a flip, but
Oh, wow. Inside a library?
yes, inside the
Oh,
library,
that's lovely.
bats to monitor to keep the insect populations
That's
down.
great.
Books don't degrade.
Wow. Wow.
Funny
Fascinating.
story.
I'm curious if to hear from anyone who's more on the consumer end of things. What is this making you think about in terms of your relationship to food and farming and land, and even maybe your own backyard? Have we got anyone here from that group? Perhaps not, or perhaps.
Yeah, I'm interested in the whole thing.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Great.
right the way through. But I'm not a producer, except I've got my own garden. But I work with, I support other people with their soils and their growing projects. Um, I don't know. I was always interested in the human microbiome first, which just came through teaching and getting people to listen to their stomach and their intuition rather than try and double think everything with their brain. And then, so I guess I was already interested in the stomach. And then there's a very good parallel between how the life in the stomach and the life in the soil, I think. And you can communicate with people through their stomach rather than, it sometimes helps if you're talking on the consumer side, since there are quite a lot of people, really do care about their health. And yeah, so I'm quite interested in sorry, that might be going off on a tangent, so stop me.
No. Love to hear from you.
I might be plant, what are they called, polyphenols? So plants that have lots of colour in their, like beetroot or carrots or berries or whatever, plums, are good to eat. So I was working with just started talking about the idea of growing a garden that just had plants with very high polyphenols. So I previously worked on a project to do with weeds with proven medicinal values. So it sort of links up going
Oh, that's
back.
lovely. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
actually how I got into this, was first through being a herbalist,
Yeah.
and then through, through human nutrition, and then
Yeah, it's
through
very-
soil. So it's kind of working my way through it all. And
Yeah.
and the next one in this series, which Deborah could put the dates in the chat, will be really connecting all of those dots together, all the way from cell membranes to the gut microbiome, all the way up to grazing animals and how they make choices through a landscape.
Yeah, today.
So that'll be
Yeah.
in a week or two. We'll be doing one of those. So yeah.
Yeah. Today I was offering up the bags of soils I collected to the horses to pick which ones they
Ah.
just to see how they reacted.
Yeah.
And I think they just saw a plastic bag and thought it was something to eat. But I might take it a bit further once I've got their trust, just to see what they do.
Yeah.
Because the soil was
Interesting.
smelling amazing today. Wait, that's it.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Glad you're here. Anyone else want to tell us a bit about your context? All right. Well, why don't we maybe let's take a 1-minute stretch break. Is always a good idea. Rest your mind, let the dog out or whatever, and then we'll come right back and keep going. Okay. Resume the recording here. All right. Any other questions before we go back?
I just wanted to say, as a consumer, I feel very strongly that the choices I make when I'm buying meat can have a huge impact on the land, either positive or negative. Really,
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's so, it's such a huge difference between one end of the spectrum and the other. How meat is produced and what the effect of how it's produced is on everything, not just on our own health, but also on the health of the soil and the health of all the other life that lives there, and biodiversity, and including on like local temperatures and things like that. So
I also wanted to say that I think in terms of all of this as well, is how much work we give ourselves. If we're relying on nature to do what it should be doing, we should have a lot more free time and a lot less work. But
yeah,
as a society, if we're trying to control everything, we're trying to take all their jobs away from them, we're creating more and more work for ourselves.
Yeah.
And, we're all overwhelmed and tired, and we're all probably a bit tired now. It's coming up at 9 o'clock at night now. And it's just like, I think if everything's working in nature and everything's allowed to have its role, and even in a food system, a farming system, there's probably less work to be done.
Yeah, I agree. And also, if we were to start doing more villaging and less homesteading, nothing wrong with homesteading, but if we were to this person does the chickens and that person does the herbs and this person does the grains, etc., then everybody's got a little less work as well. But still keeping it all local, and I think that's quite possible. It's a matter of building some of those relationships back that we've lost over time by having everything come from far away, or everything coming from enormous farms, etc. So I've got an incoming dog here, so there might be a little bit of pitter patter in the background. Okay, I'm going to go back to this slideshow here. Okay. So just one way of thinking about this, and sort of getting a sense of your own context, is to think about when heavy rain falls near you, what happens to the water, and to get very curious about that, to figure out what's the, where does it soak in, and where does it run off? And not just what's happening very locally, but what does that mean downstream from you? And one activity I love to do is to go out for a walk in the rain with a group of people and follow those flows of water and see what we can figure out. Because we tend to look at it afterwards, but if you go out in and slosh around in your boots, you can really see quite a bit about how the land is working in different places. And then also, as you're learning more about how to grow a soil sponge, to think about what your role is in those effects, and why does it matter that it's soaking in where you are, whether it's just in a rain garden in your backyard or across a farm, or even in an urban landscape. Whether our driveway is paved or gravel makes a difference. Whether the soils in our garden are compacted makes a difference. How tall you mow the grass in your lawn makes a difference to how well water soaks in. So getting really curious about how it's working right around you, and also following those flows downstream and seeing where is the water going. And you can do that both literally by going out for a walk, but also looking at maps. I have a new friend named Mitch Brolick, who we just looked at a map of my neighborhood in terms of the slope and where the water seems like it would go, and then we were talking through where does it actually go. So it's really quite fun, and it's also quite fun to do with young people, and children really enjoy that activity as well. So this part is a little bit of restatement and review, but different ways of thinking about it. The term soil health is very popular, but it's kind of hard to define. So I like to say that soil health can be determined by the structural and functional integrity of a soil, and that the structural and functional integrity of a soil is created by the biological integrity of a place. And you don't get that structural and functional integrity of that soil sponge unless you have biological integrity above ground. And that means a lot of diversity and good management. So when we think about all of the effects of flooding and drought and erosion and biodiversity loss, etc., and all of the ways that we're putting our money toward the effects of that, I like to ask, what are we going to use our time and money and energy and resources and creativity to help repair and regenerate? Are we going to use it to keep rebuilding roads and putting in culverts, building large dams to hold back water so there's enough water for, to held at the surface, but then it's drying it out everywhere else? Are we going to use it to build bigger and bigger water treatment plants? Are we going to build bigger and bigger hospitals to deal with all of the public health effects of not having a healthy soil sponge, which we'll get more into, but you can already start to see with water quality, air quality, food quality, etc., that there are many, many costs of this? Or are we going to use that time and money and energy and creativity to figure out how to rebuild that biological integrity of the place? And I think that's a big question for all of us, because we are spending so much energy and so much of our mental energy on these, these kinds of big technological solutions. And when we think about climate change, mostly today we've been talking about resilience, but like I said, there are incredible changes in the climate itself when we are managing land in ways that are more, have more of this effect. So all of the vegetation here is all taking up water from the soil sponge and transpiring it out as it's photosynthesizing. As the plants are growing, water has to come up through the root zone, come out through the leaves, and to transpire it or evapotranspire it, which means turning it from liquid back into a gas or a vapor in the air. In order for a plant to do that, it uses energy. So it takes heat that we can feel in the air, and it uses that heat to evaporate the water, and it cools the air by doing that. It's the way that an air conditioner works. It's the reason that that sweating cools you off. And it does it not just for the plant leaf itself, but the air around it, because that's where the heat is coming from. So it takes what's called sensible heat that you can feel and turns it into latent heat that is no longer heating the air. It's no longer heating the soil surface. It's no longer heating the tree itself. And that heat doesn't become something you can feel again until it recondenses as mist or clouds or rain much higher up. So it's literally a pump that is like an air conditioner that is taking heat from the surface, from the air around us, and moving it upwards, and eventually releasing a lot of it out into the atmosphere higher up, so it never comes back to Earth. So that's one of the primary reasons why having much more diverse green growth is going to make a huge difference. If you think about, if this were all grazed down to, just like this tall, right, or mowed down in someone's lawn, and if it was only one shape of leaf and there was bare soil mixed in between, or if you tilled it and left it bare for a whole season, none of that cooling is happening. This, having, grasses that are, well, let's go in the foreground here, if it's up above your knee, that might be 10 times as much cooling that it's providing as if it was down at the top of your shoes. And this is really, really huge amounts of cooling. If you look at a recent article in The Guardian, I'll try to put it, or maybe Deborah, you can search. It's the one on botanical gardens are much cooler than city streets. It's a recent article in The Guardian. It can be far, far cooler. Like, I don't know, you're in Fahrenheit or metric now there in terms of temperatures, but, like 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit cooler, 8 to 10 degrees Celsius cooler, 5 to 10 degrees Celsius cooler. And that's because in a botanical garden or in a rain garden or in a wetland, those places, there's almost always water at the root zone, right? They're always watering those plants. So, and I saw the last time I was in London, they're starting to put these nets with plants growing on them to help cool the air up in the taller buildings. But in the old days, even just letting ivy grow on a structure, and they say, oh no, we don't want ivy, it's going to pull apart the bricks. But in fact, they found that ivy helps to keep brick buildings from degrading because they don't have such huge vacillations between hot and cold. So it can really, really cool the inside of a building. We're talking about reduced air conditioning bills. We're talking also about reduced heating bills by having hedgerows and rows of trees, because that breaks the wind. So it actually helps to keep things warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. And aren't plants clever that they lose their leaves in the winter so that the sun's rays can penetrate more, and in the summer they provide all of that shade in addition to the transpiration. When we have really diverse vegetation across a continent, we get something called the biotic pump working, where all of that evaporation and condensation happening actually creates a vacuum that sucks in the moist air from the oceans and moves it evenly across a landscape, rather than having just storms on the coast and dryness inland. This is even more important in larger continents, like in Europe and in North America, etc. But even in, I think you're starting to see some of this even in the UK, where you're having maybe larger coastal storms and a bit more drought inland, and having that runoff affecting the coastline as well, right? Okay.
Looking at your slide there, do you do the two together? what
Yes.
really strikes me is that the complexity of forms on the right is mirrored in the complexity of forms on the left.
Right, right. It's true. Yeah. And if we were to look at, I don't really have a good close-up slide of soil that's unaggregated, but it would just look like a pile of little tiny rocks, right? There wouldn't be any of that space or any of those funny little cavernous, stalactites and things like that, right?
I always think of the permaculture principle, which is taken from observing nature, about increasing the edge, where one I can't think what the word is, but where, just like where the field here meets the
Yes.
sea, the
Yep. The river. Yep.
river is winding, so it's increasing edge. And then if you look at all the edges of these plants, that's where all the interesting interactions happen.
Yes, and that's actually so. So when we look at the right-hand slide, that edge also means look at how much more surface area there is for the
Yeah.
plant roots and the fungi and the bacteria to access the nutrients than if they were all just slammed together into one big clump, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that surface area of nutrients is also a surface area for water films. When you have a dry spell, these fungal hyphae can get the water that's stuck to the edges here that a plant root can't really soak up. A plant root acts a little bit more like a straw. So it's just sucking up what it can from these larger spaces, right? So, but if these are empty, the plant root can't really get the water. But these fungal hyphae connect into plant roots further along, and they can go explore and get these water films, which can be enough to provide enough water to keep a plant alive for a few days. The other thing is that the life that's underground, which we don't see at this magnification, but we would, as someone was talking about, when you start looking under a microscope that's stronger, there's all kinds of life in here. And every time that living things eat each other, they excrete some water. So when you wake up the soil biology underground, there's actually quite a bit of metabolic water made available, just like grazing animals can take a plant, right? They can eat grass all day. And when they're grazing on grass like this, they don't necessarily even need to come over to take a drink out of the river because there's so much water in the vegetation. And then, of course, they're urinating some of that back out onto the land and providing that moisture again. So life takes nutrients and water that are bound up in living cells and keeps making it re-available in different forms, different sizes for all different kinds of workers in the workforce. Okay, let's see. I think we're running to the end of the formal thing here. We maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this next time. But if you think about the difference between summer in the city and summer in the country, and the cycle of heat through the day and what it's like to walk barefoot on pavement versus in grass, you start to get a sense of how the biological systems actually regulate the climate. So a little review that the soil sponge keeps soil particles intact in wind events, right? And so we talked about better air quality, cleaner snow, slower melting of glaciers. That creates better albedo effect, and also cooler air temperatures and longer seasonal stream flow into the valleys. More space underground, easier for plant roots to grow and for these fungi to explore. The nutrient integrity of plants improves, improving the health of all of life. We'll get into that next week. And plant tissues are less likely to become diseased or freeze, in part because of the insulating effect underground, but also because as their nutrient integrity of the plants improves, their cell walls are stronger, and they also have, just like salt water is harder to freeze, as what's inside the plant cells is more complex and less just plain water, it's harder to freeze. So we have a lot less frost damage. And then there's this habitat underground, air, water, food, and a regulated climate for all of that life underground, including the plants. Soaking up rain, filtering water, reducing flood risk, reducing drought risk, refilling groundwater and wells and springs, storing that water underground for plant growth, which is both photosynthesis and transpiration. And by doing that, it's kickstarting the whole water cycle on land and even back into the oceans. And the carbon cycle, because plants are taking CO2 from the atmosphere, water from their roots, solar energy in the form of sunlight, and turning it into themselves, and then turning it into passing that energy and carbon along through the food web to all of life. And so it's keeping that CO2 in living form, which in plants also is cooling the air through transpiration. So the more life we have, the less atmospheric CO2 there is. And the more plants there are, the more they're taking in atmospheric CO2, storing it in their tissues, passing it along through the food web, while also cooling the air through transpiration and cooling the surface through shade, and driving that biotic pump that we talked about that moves moisture across continents. So that's that biotic climate cycle, not just the biotic pump, but that whole cycle of how weather and temperature work on Earth is very, very, very much driven by plants, everything that works with plants, both underground and above ground, grazing animals, keeping things moving, keeping seeds moving, keeping nutrients going uphill. All of that is helping with the climate regulation. So I like to talk about other species as being essential workers. You know, we talked a lot about essential workers during the pandemic. Great intelligence, great creativity, far under recognized. Just we don't think about how much work is going on all around us. That's part of what we need to be able to image in order to understand how to manage land, how to farm, what food to buy, all of that. And this biological workforce needs good working conditions. So if we think about those soil health principles, but in the sense of that we are helping to create good working conditions for the workforce, all of life needs food and water year round. All of life needs protection from sun and wind and rain, right? So if we think about what that means in terms of the soil sponge or a landscape that we have living in dead plants on the surface, we have space underground for water and air and food. We didn't even talk about air here. Protection from toxic chemicals. We don't want our workers to be in touch with toxic chemicals, and that's true also of all of the life underground, the fungi, the bacteria, the earthworms, all of the plants, everything. Acceptance and welcome and respect for a diverse workforce, that the more diversity there is, the more intelligence there is in the system, and the more opportunities for evolution and resilience as well, that if one thing can't do something or gets a disease, then there are other aspects of the system that can jump in and take over. Self-organizing workers trusted to make their own adaptive decisions. When we think about grazing animals, we'll talk more about this when we talk about the intelligence of grazing animals, when they're allowed to decide what plants they want to eat when and how much, and, in what order, etc. But also we're learning about something called quorum sensing, which is what happens particularly with bacteria, that when you get enough together, they start really showing great intelligence in organizing, in knowing what to do next in terms of what to do with nutrients, and how to organize themselves into communities of practice that are doing the right thing, that we could never ever figure out how to make that many decisions as fast as they do. Payment, we can't pay the workforce with dollars or pounds or euros. But I don't think that creating markets for ecosystem services is the answer. I think we need to think of what are we giving back to the land around us? How do living systems reinvest the nutrients, the water, et cetera, in themselves, in their own communities? If we think about that as these flows of energy moving through a system, I'm moving away from these kind of economic metaphors, but really there are these flows that if we get in the way can really slow things down. And then having evolving relationships within a larger community. So we don't want to just assume that just having a single monoculture that's protected from everything else is necessarily going to create the healthiest system. So having big feedlots with all the pigs in one place getting only one kind of food is not actually creating a biological workforce of healthy pigs or of healthy plants or healthy fungi or anything else, right? So this is part of what it means to be alive, is to be doing work and working in these ways, right? And Peter Donovan, who's one of the people I first traveled with when I was learning all of these things, we traveled to different farms and ranches all across North America doing monitoring of soil carbon, of water infiltration, of bulk density, a lot of those things that we were talking about earlier. That the issue is that over vast areas of the world, the biosphere is not doing enough work. With livestock confined and crop monocultures dependent on fossil fuel energy or fertilizers to maintain them, too many of the animals are in prison, too many of the plants are on welfare, and too many of the microbes are dead. But we can actually change all of that. Okay, I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions or comments or goodbyes. I think we're at the end of our formal time. Is that right, Deborah?
Well, our formal time was actually 8:45, which was my mistake. I forgot to correct you earlier, so it people.
So we've gone over.
We've gone over, yeah.
Oh, okay.
But thank you so much. That was really inspiring, and as ever, I could listen to several parts several times over.
Yes.
Embed them. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, I'm happy if there are questions. I'm happy to wait for a few minutes.
Didi, would you say a little bit more about where you are? I just think it's quite nice for people to know.
Yes. So I'm in Vermont, which is northeastern United States. We're right on the border. The bordering states here are New Hampshire, New York on the other side, and Canada, Montreal. Quebec is just north of us, and then Massachusetts is to the south. And it's very rural here. I live on 10 wooded acres surrounded by about 350 to 400 acres of grazing land and hay fields. And it's a tiny town of 2,000 people divided into 5 villages. But close to a university and a big hospital and some other things. So we sort of an interesting edge effect here in terms of rural versus not really urban. Even the university is very rural, but.
And you're still in the snow? Do you still have snow?
Still, yeah, we still have almost 2 feet of snow, so up to the knees. So yeah.
And you're in the afternoon there.
Yes, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon here. Yeah.
Well, apologies if we're a bit sleepy here because it's
no, I know.
dark and cold. Yeah. Thank you. That was wonderful. And I did put in the chat if anybody wants to scroll back. There's lots of articles, and actually my youngest daughter works at Kew Gardens, and she sent me a report recently that's an update on those articles in the Guardian talking about how Kew cools the surrounding part of the city. I can't remember how far it went.
Is that the
there is one that's about Botanic Gardens.
Okay, I'm going to open both of these. Let's see here, and then I'll read them after.
But they've done more research, which has just come out of Kew itself.
Oh, that's great.
It was
Yeah.
extraordinary, the amount of cooling for I think it was for 3 miles around. It brought the temperature down by 7 degrees, which is a lot when it's 37
Incredible.
down to 30.
And that's, and that's including the mixing of air. If you didn't have air mixing, it would be much cooler. Like if you were to measure right next to things or right on, the ground temperature, for example, in Fahrenheit could be, if the air temperature is 80 degrees, the ground under shaded trees with transpiration might be 72. And then the ground temperature of bare soil or pavement might be 150. I mean, it's huge difference. But then by the time that's been mixed in the air above it, you don't see quite such a dramatic effect. But of course, it is dissipating that much heat.
I mean, and it's
overall.
amazing Kew has that effect, 'cause there are a lot of paved paths and bare grass and short areas
Yeah.
as well as the longer. So,
Yeah.
yes, we did do some of those experiments through the program, the Pasture for Life program, and it was extraordinary, the difference. And you could see the dogs always going for the cool place.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the cattle, I don't know if you noticed this, Fidelity, but in the summer when there was a longer sward, the cattle often didn't go under the trees. They would stay out. Quite perplexing, some of the farmers I was talking to, who kind of felt they needed to go in the shade, but it was obviously that cooler temperature in the longer.
Well, I had that experience when I was traveling in India with Walter Jena, that we were under a tent in the shade, but without a lot of vegetation, because often under the tree is kind of bare, right? And incredibly hot. And we stepped out into this tall cover crop field that was like up to our shoulders, but our heads were still in the sun. And so much cooler standing in the hot sun than under the shade because of all that transpiration happening.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? And you can still quite late in the day feel the damp in the grass lower down.
Absolutely.
Is there anything you can read? Could read more about that?
Yes, actually, let me give you two. Let's see, so my Substack account has a lot of different articles and interviews. I'll put that here.
Thank you.
You may have to scroll back a bit, to just find ones that are more on that topic, but there is, there are some about how to soak up more water. There's some about cooling. There's some interviews with a number of interesting people, including the folks in India that have got a fantastic project going on with 1 million farmers. And then also, let's see, I was just going to get you to these materials here. Fact sheets, here we go. There's quite a lot here as well. And maybe, I don't know, maybe Deborah can send these around to folks who signed up. So those are, in both of those places, you'll find quite a lot of reading.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Thanks.
All right.
Well, thank you, Dee Dee.
Yeah, it's
And,
wonderful.
Look forward to seeing you on Saturday with
Yes.
a new cohort. So if you've enjoyed it and there's anybody you think might enjoy it, then please do feel free to share.
Great. And I think it's not this Saturday, is that right? It's the following one, I think.
And do they have to be Pasture for Life people?
They don't have to be Pasture for Life for this one, though.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think you're right, Dee Dee. It's the following.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it starts. So there's this series that starts this Wednesday.
Yeah.
And then the following series, the new series starts on Saturday the 15th. And we made that from 4. So particularly if you know people have children, we thought that might be a good one.
Yeah. But if you like the Wednesdays, we'll have there'll be 2 more on Wednesdays.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just thinking for the Saturday one, if people want to recommend people to come.
Right.
To start the series again, and series
Yeah.
repeating it twice, basically. And you're also welcome to come back if you.
Yes. Yeah, I know. The teachers who I've taught with, I've heard their talks 20, 30, 40 times, and I always get more out of it, more details that come out. So, and I also say things differently every time. So.
Well,